Good morning, guys. Welcome to Toby's lockdown tutorials. I thought quite a few of you are probably missing the old golden arches, so I thought this morning's brunch would be brought to you by the golden arches, lest we forget. I'm sure you've probably guessed by now, on page 90 of your book, we are going to make English muffins, so bacon egg McMuffins. So first thing I do is set up my mise en place. As you can see, most important, the coffee. Here I have my milk warming over a double boiler or a bain-marie, correct. I've got my yeast weighed out, my caster sugar weighed out. The recipe does have lard. I'm subbing that out for butter because it's better. A strong flour, or high grade flour, premium flour. You can see that it's in the bowl with the sieve. I like to weigh the bowl and the sieve together, zero it, then weigh my flour into it. That way it saves a step later on. And the last ingredient is polenta for giving it a crust. If you don't have polenta at home, semolina would work as well. So polenta is coarse cornmeal. And then obviously a tray to put them on, but I won't be needing that for quite a while because, as we know, breads do take a little bit of time. Now, especially in these times, make sure you have washed and sanitized your hand and your workspace. Make sure you have your recipe with you. Pause right now if you've lost your book, and then you can take a screenshot. And here is my trusty old milk bottle, which is my selfie stick holder. So you should be able to see what I'm doing. Okay, so 300 mils of milk warmed up to blood heat, or what we call tepid. All right, so we're probably looking around about the 36, 38 mark. If you did put a little pinky in, it shouldn't feel hot or cold. You can see that the temperature is very, very low. There's a little bit of water in there. It's not touching the bowl. Perfect. And it is perfect. So I'm going to take that off the heat now. I am going to need a tea towel. Here's a lovely tea towel with the London Tower Bridge on it. It's going to be very helpful. So wipe the excess liquid off the bottom. Just give it a little stir before you do anything, just to make sure that the heat is nice and evenly distributed through the milk. Okay, and then following that recipe, I've warmed the milk to blood heat. Now I need to stir in the yeast and the sugar. As luck would have it, I have a spoon right here. I'm going to rein in the yeast. And the sugar. Just to make sure it evenly distributes, you give it a good stir. You're just yeast. So just stirring it up a bit. Okay, at this stage, I am going to make sure it's stirred very, very, very well so that the yeast can access the lactic acids, the sugar out of the milk, and the sugar that I've just added. It's going to start to eat it and create carbon dioxide. So there should be bubbles starting to form. This will probably take about 10 minutes. I don't really want to put it back onto the stove. It might get too hot. So I'm just going to leave this here and monitor how warm it is or how cold it is, because I don't know about you, but it's a pretty cold day out there, so it could cool down quite quickly. While that is happening, when we come back from a short little commercial break, I would have sieved my flour 3 times just to make sure it's nicely aerated. It's got salt in there as well, so I want to combine those two together really well. and make sure there's no foreign objects in there. And I would have melted my lard, so I'm ready for that next step. Okay, so I'm just going to take a pause, maybe a little bit of coffee, and see you in 2 minutes. Okay, and we're back. First of all, a couple of things I missed, as I'm prone to do. Apologies for the hair. It is Shave for a Cure in New Zealand, so it's for a good cause, but I know kind of looks a bit Uncle Fester. The other one is, today I am following the recipe out of our book. If you didn't have that recipe with you, Uncle Google has a load of different recipes. Just make sure once you choose a recipe, you stick to that recipe, because if you're starting mix and match, that's when things go awry. So where we're at, I've got my yeast. Now it's only been about 10 minutes, possibly not even, but you can start to see, well, hopefully, and I do apologize for the camera work, but you can see around this side here that it's just starting to foam up. Those little bits of yeast, you can see that they're dissolving and starting to bubble up nicely. Then I've got my butter melted, preferably over a bain-marie, but Uncle Mike can help with that. And then my flour. So I'll set you back up in my trusty milk bottle. Oh, and for later, I've set up the polenta onto the tray. But first we have to mix our dough and do a bulk ferment, okay? So pretty straightforward. I like to, when I'm mixing my dough, I use a scraper, just in case it gets quite wet and sticky. And then later on I'll go to bare hands when I'm kneading, okay? Now if I put the butter in first and then the milk, sometimes that butter the milk might have cooled down by now and it might solidify, and then you've got big lumps of butter all through. This is the active ingredient. This is what you want everything, okay? So make sure once it's into a well in the middle of the flour, scrape all of the excess out just in case there's some yeasties hiding behind. No yeast left behind, okay? And then in goes my butter, and you can see the frothing of the yeast. Once it gets into that flour, it's loving the carbs from the flour. So in goes my butter, and once it's all in there, I'm just gonna, the reason I love the scraper is I can get right around the outside. You can notice I've got a nice rounded bottom bowl, so that scraper can make it right into the corners. And it's going to be a beautiful rich dough because it's made with milk and butter. So an enriched dough. And once I've mixed those ingredients together, it should form a dough. You can see I can scrape the sides so that it's nice and quick to mix. So around the outside and then through the middle, just like if we're mixing anything. And it's a very wet dough. So future reference, it'd be a really good one to do in an electric mixer. Obviously just be mindful, electric mixers aren't necessarily designed to work with such dense products, so they can be put under quite a lot of strain. Okay. Now it seems quite wet and sticky. Once I've worked it quite a lot, it'll develop that gluten which will hold it all together. It'll stop being sticky. Then I'm going to get a clean bowl that's at least twice the size of the dough. Lightly oil it. I'm going to cover it with Glad wrap or a tea towel, and I'm going to let the dough bulk ferment. So that is the proving stage while it's still as one big dough. Then we're going to scale it out into the size that we want, and we're going to prove it one more time so that it doubles in size, becomes nice and light and fluffy, and our finished product is delightful. So at this stage, as I said, I'm just going to mix it with the scraper to start with. A little bit less talking now because more working, and I want this dough to become nice and smooth and less sticky. So I'm using the heel of my hand just to stretch it and bring it together. You could do this stage on the bench, lightly floured bench. You don't want to put too much flour in, otherwise it changes the ratio of dough. And you can see already it's starting to become less sticky. Develop it. So I like to stretch it, roll it back on itself, turn it. Obviously, before you start doing this, make sure that your bench is clean. You don't really want to be picking up yesterday morning's breakfast toast crumbs in your muffin mix. Can I over knead it? Not really. It'd take quite a bit to over knead a dough. But you can see, although it looks quite wet and sticky, it is sensational. And with dough generally, the wetter the better. The wetter it is, the more it allows the yeast to grow or to produce carbon dioxide, which is what gives us that beautiful light fluffy texture. And you can see by the colour, it is a beautiful, rich, supple dough. Okie dokie. So, it's quite smooth. I'll probably give it another couple of minutes of kneading. Then I'm going to clean my bowl, lightly oil it, so that I can prove it. Okay, so that was a little bit of CrossFit kitchen styles. As you can see, I've cleaned my bowl. There's just a little bit of oil in the bottom. I'm going to put my bulk dough in, just roll it over. That oil is going to help stop a skin forming. And as suggested, you can either just drape a tea towel over it, put it in a warm place, or cover it with Glad wrap. Glad wrap's probably slightly more hygienic, but the tea towel is convenient. So at this stage, we've got our dough, and it is beautiful, rich dough. We want it to double in size, so we're taking a mental picture right now of its size. We want it to be nice and light and fluffy. Then, as the recipe says, so we've mixed the ingredients, we've kneaded the ingredients to develop the gluten until it's smooth and elastic. Now it's bulk fermenting. Then we're going to knock it back which means to knock out the large air bubbles. Then we're going to scale it, so measure it down into the sizes that we want for our English muffins, and then we're going to shape those. So you can see there's quite a few different steps to making a delicious brunch commodity. I will see you in probably close to an hour once that has had its chance to double in size. Could be a little bit longer on a day like today. It's not exactly the warmest day out there, not tropical. Ciao. Okay, so this has been bulk fermenting or proving for approximately one episode of Game of Thrones. So now it is time to knock it back and scale or shape our finished product. So what we're going to do, we're going to take it over here, we're going to knock it back so it's got all these nice big air bubbles, and we're just going to knock out all of the large air bubbles. There's two ways that we can shape our dough. We can follow the recipe and roll it out into about 2 centimeter thick slab and then use a cutter. That would be good because then you will have nice uniform dough. Or you can be dodgy like me and form it into balls and just give them a good squash, which is what I'm going to roll with. So I'm just going to put you back into the holder, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to lift the dough out of the bowl, and then I'm going to zero the scales, and that'll tell me how much dough I have. So lift it up, on, okay, so there's 800 grams, so I can get 10 80-gram muffins out of that. Let's see how big 80 grams is. Now, the reason I love this scale is I've just cleaned and sanitized that. So instead of putting baking paper down, I can just go straight onto there, and then I will take it off and clean it afterwards. So 80-gram muffin, no, I'm going to go for 8 100-gram muffins. So basically just decide how big a muffin you want. 100 grams is going to be quite a big muffin. Probably a little bit bigger than the old golden arches, but and that scaling the whole dough is a good idea, because then you end up, you know, you're going to end up with the same amount or the right amount. Spot on. And the reason we scale out the dough is even that much, 5 grams, by the time it's proven, will be twice that size. So if our dough balls are even 5 to 10 grams out, it's going to affect the finished product. So now I'm going to bring my tray with the polenta on it, and as I said, I'm just going to, just like we're doing a normal round bun, you can do it on the bench. Remember, a little bit of pressure and slowly cup your hand up. You'll end up with a beautiful, nice, smooth bun. And this one I'm just going to even out, because remembering they will prove again. So they will become light and fluffy. So then into the polenta, or onto the polenta. Okay, give them a good squash to make them nice and even. And at this stage you can smell the milk, the butter in these have just made it sensational. I'm going to continue with the rest of them. Then I'm going to sprinkle a little bit of polenta on top of each. And once I've done all of my muffins, I'm going to grab this tea towel. Make sure it's a clean tea towel. The one that I used on my dough before, I'm just going to lay it over the top and put it back into a nice warm spot, again, to do that final proof. Once they're final proofed, that's when we need to be very careful. We don't want to knock out any of the air or carbon dioxide that the yeast has produced, which is going to make them light and fluffy. And at that stage, we are pretty much ready to cook our delightful muffins. So I'll continue rolling these and then I'll leave them to proof. I would suggest maybe about half an hour, depending on the weather. A lot of the time, the warmth of your room and all of that. So I won't get in another episode of Game of Thrones. Maybe I'll have to go for a sitcom instead. See you in half an hour. Okay, now that wasn't so bad, was it? Probably about 20-25 minutes. Managed to get a load of dishes through and the like. So now you can see that they're nice and light and fluffy. They've doubled in size, most of them. A little bit more active around the edges, funnily enough. So I'm going to cook these. There's a couple of different ways you could cook them. I believe the recipe says to seal them in an iron skillet until brown on the outside and then finish them in the oven. That is a very good method because that way you get that nice caramelization on the outside but cooked through to the middle. I'm going to try a slightly different method. I've got my pan, I've got a little bit of oil in there. So you don't want to fry them, but you don't want them to stick. So we're just going to lightly oil the pan. I've chosen a pan that has a lid. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to turn it up. So I've got the gas on about medium to high so that the pan can warm up a little bit. And that'll just help the muffins seal when it goes in. And then when it does go in, I'm going to very carefully lift it off the paper. Very gently put it in. You can see the downside to my lidded pan is it's a little bit small, but that's okay. Alright, then I'm going to put my lid on. And what that's going to help to do is to cook it through as they seal on the outside. Now, as you can probably tell, I'm quite lucky on 2 counts with 2 essential workers in the house. One gets up at 7, so I managed to get up and get all of this. The other reason I'm really lucky is the rest of the household are teenagers, so they're not quite up yet. So if I was making these for brunch, I would generally make them the night before, which would mean all of this is done in between ad breaks, basically. So now I've just turned that down. Okay, they're in there, they're going to brown on one side. I need some way to flip them over. I probably wouldn't use tongs because that would squash them, and we want to keep all of that air inside. And I want to leave them for a good few minutes just to brown off on one side. If you're curious, being very careful, gently lift, nowhere near, crank up that, because we do want them to get a nice seal on them. I have turned the oven on for just in case I need it, right? So I do want to make sure that they don't brown too much on the outside by the time they're cooked on the inside. So that's my technique. You could just use a larger pan. You could use a flat griddle plate. Barbecue would be perfect, just to seal them off and then finish them in the oven to cook through. I'm going to continue cooking these the next time you see me, we'll hopefully be putting together. I might even show you how to fry the egg in the bacon to put inside. Bacon egg McMuffin needs bacon and egg. To be honest, it's very, very similar technique. I would use the lid just to make sure that it cooks through nice and evenly, because you don't really want to wear an undercooked fried egg. If you did want to, I don't really like to, but I don't use cake rings, but you could use a cutter. Just spray it out really well for as an egg ring when you're cooking the eggs, but we'll get to that later. Okay, let's see how these are browning. Again, not really, so give them their time. You can see that they're proving even in the pan. They're becoming beautiful and light and fluffy. Let me have a look. Okay, so it's just starting to brown off nicely there. I'm actually going to add just a little splash of oil into the pan, but not too much. And I'm just going to turn that right down low so it gets a nice even colour. Okay, so I'm going to finish cooking these through, and then I will see you for the finished product. Okay, so they're starting to brown quite nicely. I've changed my mind, as I'm prone to do. If I do leave them in the pan until they cook through, they'll probably get a bit too dark on the outside. So these guys here, you can see they're light and fluffy. They're quite a large muffin. If you wanted it closer to the Golden Arches size, I would suggest probably go for the 10 80-gram muffins rather than the 8 100 grams, or even smaller if you wanted to. Yeah, so I'm just going to finish sealing these back onto the tray into the oven to cook through. Okay, so now to the finishing. We have our English muffins. We have, like I say, I cook my eggs very similar to the way I started the muffins. Low temperature, a little bit of oil, not too much. I know they're fried, but you don't want it deep fried. And then you can see I've done one in a ring, which will hold its shape a little bit more. I don't normally bother, but that ring I just sprayed with oil so it doesn't stick. And the lid on, you can see that it's nice. Slow cooking method with the lid on will make sure that the yolks cook nice and evenly. I've got my delicious cup of lemon verbena and borage tea. I've got my bacon, which I've just fried off, and it's just sitting, getting rid of a little bit of the excess fat, but you know. And then the pièce de résistance, our muffin. So I'm going to slice this so carefully. Let's use the milk bottle. Okay, so again, trying to get it nice and flat. It's not quite a sponge cake, but, and you can see that beautiful light texture. Delightful. So with that guy there, I'm just going to lightly toast it. You can see our spreads of choices, but it's up to you. You could make your own mayonnaise now that you know how. I quite like some tomato and pesto. Remember that onion jam we used? That was pretty nice in this dish. But the kids are pretty simple, not like that, but yeah, mayonnaise and tomato sauce, come on. And I've even saved a little bit of a garnish. Okay, I'm sure you can work out how to put this together. Spread on the outside, bacon, egg, sandwich it together, munch on in. Delightful. You can see that now that the whites are covering over the top, those eggs are ready to go. So I'm going to turn that off so they don't overcook. I'm going to put this guy together. I hope you've enjoyed McDonald's a la Toby Tudor. I will be back for one last installment to show you the finished product. Cheers. Okay, and there it is, better than I bought one. Delicious, light, fluffy English muffins, lightly toasted with some crispy bacon and fried eggs, and oh, look at that garnish. And as I just put the lid on top, that egg will just lightly pop. Sensational. Enjoy. And what better way to spend a day of torrential downfall than to make yourself a delicious meal and jump onto the board games. Enjoy. Kia kaha, keep safe.